Tonight, as every sound begins to soften and the outer world starts to slow, you may allow yourself to drift gently into a story from very far away, so far that it unfolds before even the memory of humankind. Welcome to Stories for Sleep, a place where stories are not only to be understood, but to be felt. If journeys like this help you relax and fall asleep more easily, you may gently subscribe as a way of keeping a quiet space for yourself whenever night returns. There is something very strange, we often believe, that this world, this climate, this sky, this rhythm of life is something given, that seasons come and go, that the earth is stable, that tomorrow will not be very different from today. But about 12800 years ago, everything changed. Not slowly, not over thousands of years, but almost in a single moment of Earth's history. Temperatures dropped suddenly. Ice returned. A world that had been warming, reviving, was abruptly pulled back into the cold. This event is now known as the Younger Dryas. And what is most remarkable is, even to this day, no one knows for certain why. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung, there are things, in the world as within the human mind, that cannot always be fully explained by logic. There are movements that take place in deeper layers, places where reason only touches the surface. Tonight, we will not only search for an answer to an ancient mystery, we will listen to it, the way you listen to a dream, gently, without rushing, without needing to understand everything. You will see a world recovering after the Ice Age, then witness it suddenly freeze again. You will move through hypotheses, from the ocean, the sky, to unseen forces of the cosmos. You will see giant creatures disappear, and humans, fragile yet resilient, learn to adapt to change, and unknowingly lay the foundation for the civilization we live in today. But deeper than all of that is a very quiet question, very close, and perhaps very familiar to you. What happens when everything you believe to be stable suddenly changes? Because sometimes the greatest upheavals do not come from the outside, but from deeper layers within ourselves. And perhaps the story of Earth 12800 years ago is not only a story about climate, but a mirror reflecting how we change, how we lose, and how we begin again. Now, let everything slow down. Let this voice become a gentle current, and you only need to listen. We begin the world before the collapse about 12800 years. The Earth was in a state very different from what we usually imagine about the distant past. No longer a world locked in ice, no longer vast frozen lands where life struggled to survive. Instead, everything was gradually warming, not fast, not abrupt, but a very slow change, enough to create a feeling subtle that life was returning. Massive ice sheets that had remained still for thousands of years began to melt, drop by drop, then into streams, then into rivers. Water flowed through lands once frozen, carrying energy, carrying movement, carrying a promise that this world was opening once more. Jung once wrote, "Life is a process of becoming. Life does not stand still. It is always moving, always transforming, always becoming something new." And in that moment, the earth, too, was becoming. As water returned, life spread with it. Lands once empty began to turn green. Grass grew, trees grew, forests slowly formed, not loudly, not dramatically, just a process, quiet yet unstoppable. New ecosystems emerged. Animals began to thrive. Giant creatures, mammoths, giant ground, Sloths, great herds, moved across open plains. They lived in a world becoming easier, abundant food, plentiful water, vast space, a temporary balance, but long enough to create a very particular feeling that everything was moving in the right direction, that the future could be trusted. And if you listen deeply, you may recognize that feeling is not unfamiliar. Those are the moments in life when everything seems fine, no need to try too hard, no major disruptions, just everything flowing. Humans also began to change, no longer constantly moving, no longer entirely dependent on what they happened to find. They began to stay a little longer, to observe more, to understand more deeply. Groups expanded their territories, not because they were pushed away, but because they could choose. A very small difference, but with profound meaning. Somewhere within these slow changes, something began to form, an idea, not yet clear, not yet named, but growing, that humans did not only exist, but could build, create, shape the future. Jung once said, "Man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is." Humans do not simply accept reality, they always seek to become something else. And in that moment, perhaps for the first time, that seemed possible. And when you look at the whole picture, water flowing, trees growing, animals thriving, humans stabilizing, everything seemed to be moving toward something better, more stable, more understandable, more predictable, a world where you could begin to believe that tomorrow would be like today, and perhaps even better. There were no clear warning signs, no major disturbances, just a gentle current, a rhythm very easy to trust. But Jung once reminded, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. As everything becomes brighter, the shadow also begins to form, quietly, without urgency, just there, waiting. And sometimes it is in the most peaceful moments that we are least prepared for change, the sudden freeze, and then, without a clear warning, no signal strong enough to make everything stop, just a change, very small. At first, hard to notice, temperature dropped a little, not enough to cause panic, not enough to break everything immediately, just a feeling that the air was different, a little colder, a little drier, like a passing wind that did not disappear. And then, those small changes did not stop, they continued, quietly but steadily. Winters grew longer, warm seasons shorter, rivers no longer flowed as strongly. Land once soft began to harden, not suddenly, but enough for those living within it to begin to feel that something was shifting. Jung once wrote, "Something unknown is doing we don't know what." There are changes that happen before we understand, before we name them, before we realize that everything is no longer the same. And if you listen deeply, you may notice this feeling is familiar. It is when everything in your life is still, is buried, but no longer as it once was. No major event, no clear moment, just a slight misalignment, a shift you cannot explain, but you can feel. And then it was no longer subtle. Temperature kept falling, faster, clearer. The warming trend reversed, not slowly, but almost abruptly, in a very short span relative to Earth's history. The Earth began to cool once again, and then the changes were no longer at the edge of perception. They became undeniable, unmistakable, irreversible. Temperature continued to fall without stopping, without hesitation. Lands once warm grew cold quickly, not over thousands of years, but in a very short time. Compared to Earth's slow rhythm, a reversal, complete ice returned, not only in distant places, but spreading slowly yet surely. Rivers, once strong, began to slow, then frozy. Lakes, once reflecting the sky, became still, hardened, without movement. Life did not disappear at once, but was restrained, slowed, placed into a state more difficult. Forests, once expanding, no longer grew the same. Trees slowed, some vanished. Ecosystems, once balanced, began to change, not loudly, but deeply, very deeply. Jung once wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can only be outgrown. There are changes that cannot be stopped, cannot be solved in familiar ways. They can only be lived through, endured, outgrown." And for humans, this was no longer abstract. It became real. Food sources changed. Animals migrated. Lands once easy became harsh. There was no long time to adapt slowly. Everything happened faster, clearer, unavoidable. And if you listen deeply, you may realize this is not only Earth's story, but a deeply human experience. The moment when everything that felt stable suddenly changes, not by plan, not by desire. It simply happens, and you have no choice but to be within it. And then, as the world began to freeze, a great question slowly emerged, not only for us today, but perhaps for those who lived then. What caused all of this? Why could a warming world reverse so quickly? Was it the Earth, the ocean, or something from farther away, from the sky they could not see? And now, as we stand in the present, looking back, something very strange appears. We know this event happened. We have evidence in ancient ice layers, in ocean sediments, in traces of life that changed. We can measure, we can date it, we can see clearly that temperature dropped very fast, almost suddenly. But when we ask a simple question, why, everything becomes unclear. There is no single answer, no clear cause, only hypotheses, possibilities, incomplete fragments. Jung once wrote, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. The most beautiful thing is not understanding everything, but touching the unknown." And the younger Dryas is exactly that, a mystery, still open. Perhaps it was the ocean, a disrupted current. Perhaps the sky, a cosmic object. Perhaps the Earth, an internal shift. Or, all at once, a chain reaction, interconnected, that we are only beginning to understand. And perhaps what matters most is not finding a perfect answer, but realizing that this world is more complex than we can fully grasp, not entirely controllable, not entirely predictable, only to be experienced, to be lived with. And if you listen deeply, you may realize this too is true for you. Not every change in your life has a clear reason. Not every shift can be explained at once. Some moments simply happen, and you are within them. And in those moments, something new begins to form, not immediately, not clearly, but beginning. And then, as we go deeper, not only into what happened, but into the unanswered questions, another journey begins. No longer observation, but searching. Scientists look into data, ice layers, dust particles, small traces left behind, and from that, they try to piece together a story, incomplete, but enough to continue the unsolved mystery. And then, as we move beyond that event, no longer only looking at the cold, no longer only sensing the change, a question begins to grow. Not what happened, but why? Why would a warming world suddenly freeze? Why would a cycle that seemed stable be reversed so quickly? And the deeper we go, the answers become more blurred. There is no single cause, no clear explanation, only hypotheses, different perspectives, different ways of trying to touch the unknown. One of the first hypotheses comes from the ocean. Massive ocean currents flowing across the poor planet do not only carry water, they carry heat. If one current is disrupted, heat is no longer distributed as before, and a region can cool very quickly. A small change within a large system can spread into a global shift. Another hypothesis comes from the sky. An object from space, a comet, may have broken apart before reaching Earth, releasing energy, causing wildfires, sending dust into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, and creating a winter not from Earth, but from space. There are also other hypotheses, less dramatic, but no less profound. Volcanic activity, changes in the Sunday, natural oscillations that we still do not fully understand. Carl Gustav Jung once wrote, "The more we know, the more we realize how much we do not know. The more we understand, the more we realize how little we truly know." And perhaps the younger Dryas is not a puzzle to be solved, but a reminder that this world is not always simple, not always linear, not always one cause for one result. And if you listen deeply, you may realize this is also true for your own mind. Not every emotion has a clear reason. Not every change can be traced back to a single beginning. There are things that are the result of many layers stacked together, experiences, memories, influences you are not fully aware of. And just like the Earth, you are a complex system, deep, interconnected, and not entirely predictable. And then, as we remain with these hypotheses, without trying to choose a single answer, something begins to appear. Not certainty, but complexity. The ocean is not only water, it is a living system. Currents flow slowly, very slowly, yet they carry immense heat from the tropics to colder regions, keeping the planet in a fragile balance. And if a massive amount of fresh water flows into the ocean, that balance can be disrupted. No great force is required, only a change in the right place, at the right moment. Jung once wrote, "Even a small thing can have a decisive influence on the whole. A small thing can change an entire system, not because it is large, but because it touches a critical point." And then we turn to the sky, where everything seems farther, harder to grasp. A comet does not need to strike directly. It only needs to break apart in the atmosphere, releasing energy, creating vast fires, sending dust and particles high above, blocking the light, cooling the planet. Not forever, but enough to trigger a chain reaction. And then, there are other forces, quieter, less dramatic, yet equally important. Solar activity fluctuates. It is not always stable. Small changes in emitted energy can influence global climate, or the Earth itself moves through cycles, long oscillations that we are only beginning to understand. And when all these possibilities are placed together, something becomes clear. Perhaps there is not a single cause, but many causes occurring together, touching one another, triggering each other, creating an effect greater than the sum of its parts. Jung once said, "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts." A system cannot be understood by separating it, but by seeing the whole. And if you listen deeply, you may realize this too reflects you. You are not just one thought, not just one emotion, not just one single experience. You are a combination of many things happening at once, influencing each other, creating a state that sometimes you cannot fully explain. And perhaps what matters most is not to understand everything, but to accept that there are things always beyond our grasp. And then, as all these hypotheses are placed side by side, something very strange begins to appear. We know what happened. We can measure ancient temperatures from deep ice. We can see ecosystem changes in sediments. We can determine the moment everything reversed, very precisely, very clearly, as if the Earth recorded its own memory, layer by layer, trace by trace, not forgetting. But when the question shifts from what happened to why did it happen, everything begins to change. No longer clear, no longer certain, no longer a single answer, only possibilities, models, assumptions. We move closer, but never fully arrive. Jung once wrote, "We understand the world only by the way we understand ourselves. The way we understand the world is always limited by the way we understand ourselves. And perhaps that limit always remains. Science is powerful. It allows us to look deep into the past, to measure, to compare, to connect data. But it is not everything. It does not always provide a complete answer, because the world does not always operate in a linear way, one cause, one result, but rather many layers stacked together, interacting, creating a reality that cannot be separated. And if you listen deeply, you may realize this too is true for you. You may know what you are feeling: sadness, anxiety, fatigue, relief. But when you ask, "Why do I feel this way?" the answer is not always clear. Not one reason, but many things. Layered, past experiences, present thoughts, unspoken things, things you have not even become aware of. And perhaps what matters most is not finding a perfect answer, but remaining with the question, without rushing, without forcing, simply accepting that there are mysteries that do not need to be solved immediately. And in that quiet, something else begins to appear. Not an answer, but understanding. Not complete, but enough. And then, as all the hypotheses, the possibilities, the different paths have been opened, something very still begins to settle. Not an answer, but an acceptance that there is no single answer. The younger Dryas is not a simple story, not one cause, not a single event, but a convergence where many forces touch, where small changes combine into a great shift. No one, at that time, could see the whole, and even today, we are only seeing parts. Jung once wrote, "The truth is too complex to be expressed in a single statement." Truth does not lie in one answer, but in complexity, in layers upon layers, in things we are still discovering. And perhaps what matters most is not knowing exactly what caused everything, but realizing that this world is not fully controllable, not fully predictable, only gradually understood, little by little, over time. And if you listen deeply, you may realize there is something very similar between the earth and you. You are not a simple answer, not a single cause, not a linear story. You are a collection of many experiences, many emotions, many layers of memory, stacked together, creating something that cannot be reduced. And when you no longer try to explain everything, something very light happens. You begin to simply listen, observe, be with what is. But even if the answer is unclear, the earth does not remain silent. It stores, records. What has happened does not disappear. It is held within itself, like a memory, waiting to be read, waiting to be understood, evidence from the earth. And then, when we stop trying to find answers in hypotheses and begin to look at the earth itself, something very different begins to appear. The earth does not forget. It does not tell stories with words, but it remembers in ice, in soil, in rock, in things so small the eye cannot see. Ice layers in Greenland accumulate over thousands of years, layer by layer, stacked. Each layer is a moment, a season, a year, a state of the atmosphere, unchanged, undisturbed, simply there, waiting to be read. And when humans drill into it, they do not only extract ice, they extract time, tiny air bubbles trapped within, air from tens of thousands of years ago, still there, still intact, like a breath, preserved. And when we analyze it, something becomes clear. Temperature has changed, not gradually, but very quickly, a sudden drop, recorded clearly, undeniably. Jung once wrote, "The unconscious retains the memory of everything that has ever happened." The unconscious does not forget. It preserves everything. And perhaps the earth is the same, a vast unconscious, holding its own memory. No need for words, no need for explanation, only is avertes. And if you listen deeply, you may realize you also carry such layers, memories, experiences, stored, not always conscious, but always there, waiting to be touched. The hypothesis of the Great Lake. And then, as we move away from the traces and begin to search for a specific mechanism, a hypothesis begins to emerge, not from the sky, not from the cosmos, but from the earth itself, a place very vast, very still, yet holding an immense energy, a lake, unlike any lake today, so wide that it was almost an inland sea. It is called Lake Agassiz. This lake was formed from melting ice. Water was held back, blocked by massive walls of ice, with no outlet, only accumulating, day after day, year after year. The volume of water continued to rise. The pressure continued to build, but on the surface, everything remained quiet. No signs, no clear warnings, only a gathering, silent. Carl Gustav Jung once wrote, "What is not brought to consciousness will appear in our lives as fate. What is held back does not disappear. It simply waits for a moment to be released. And Lake Agassiz, perhaps, was the same. And then something happened. No one knows exactly when. No one saw the first moment. But the ice wall could no longer hold. It broke, not slowly, but suddenly, like a door burst open, and the entire massive body of water poured out, not like a river, but like an ocean in motion. And then, when the ice wall could no longer hold, the water surged out, not flowing, but rushing, a vast volume in motion, with no prepared path, no order, only a force, impossible to stop, impossible to control. That water found its way to the ocean, carrying energy, carrying change, not loud like a storm, but deeper, affecting the entire system. When fresh water poured into the ocean, something very subtle happened. The ocean was no longer the same, not at the surface, but within. The balance between salt water and fresh water shifted. Density changed. Ocean currents, which depend on that difference, began to slow, not stopping immediately, but no longer flowing as before. The great current that carried heat from the tropics northward weakened. Heat was no longer transported as before, and when heat no longer arrives, cold begins to spread, not from the air, but from imbalance. Jung once wrote, "Every psychic process is an image and an ass imagining. Every process begins with very small changes, but when they accumulate, they become a larger image, a new state. And what is remarkable is not the volume of water, but the location where that flow touches the system. A change at the right point can shift the entire current, like a small thought appearing at the right moment can change the way you see everything, not because it is large, but because it touches a sensitive point. And then, as the currents slow, a chain reaction begins, not immediately, but not easily reversed. Climate is pulled along, temperature drops, ice begins to return, and if you listen deeply, you may notice there are changes within you that begin the same way, not from a large event, but from a small shift in the right place, at the right moment, and then everything else begins to move with it. As fresh water spreads into the ocean, something important unfolds. Not loud, not easy to see, but deep. The great ocean currents no longer move as before, especially a crucial system, often called the ocean circulation, where warm water moves from the equator toward the north, carrying heat, carrying life, and then cold water sinks, returns, creating a loop, stable, continuous, like the heartbeat of the ocean. But when fresh water alters density, the sinking process no longer happens as before. The water is not dense enough to descend, and when one part of the cycle stops, the entire system begins to weaken, not immediately, but clearly, and not easily reversed. Heat no longer travels north. Regions once warm begin to cool, not due to lack of sunlight, but because the flow is lost, a system no longer functioning smoothly. Jung once wrote, "The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it." A small change can carry great meaning, not because of its size, but because it touches the structure. And then a chain reaction begins, not a single event, but a cascade. Temperature drops, ice forms. More light is reflected, cooling the Earth further, and that cold reinforces itself. A loop hard to stop, hard to reverse. And if you listen deeply, you may notice there are states within you that work the same way. A thought leads to a feeling leads to an action creates a state, and that state reinforces the original thought. A loop, not always visible, but very real. And like the ocean, when one part of you changes, the entire system changes with it. Not immediately, but inevitably, when we step back and see the whole process, from the lake held back to the moment of rupture, to the freshwater surge, to the slowing currents, something becomes very clear. Not a single great force, not an isolated event, but a chain, small changes, linked together, influencing each other, becoming a massive transformation, not instant, but unstoppable. Lake Agassiz was not the only cause, but it may have been the beginning. A small imbalance placed in the right position at the right time, and then the entire system responded, not because it was weak, but because it was sensitive. Jung once wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Everything that touches us is not random, but because it connects to something deeper. And the earth is the same, a change, not large on its own, but when it touches a balanced system, it can shift everything. And this is not only a story of climate, but a principle, a pattern that appears everywhere, in nature and within you. There are changes in life that begin very small, a thought, a feeling, an experience, insignificant in the moment. But when it touches something deep, it begins to spread, changing how you see, how you feel, how you live. And then, one day, you look back and realize everything is different. Not because of one big moment, but because a chain has quietly unfolded. And perhaps that is what the younger Dryas reminds us, not only about climate, but about the fragility of balance. Every system, no matter how vast, has sensitive points, place where even a small change can shift everything. But within that fragility, there is something very real, that everything is always moving, always changing, and no state is permanent. And then, as we leave the ocean, leave the currents within the earth, another perspective opens, not from below, but from the sky. Another possibility, less certain, but haunting. What if that change did not begin from Earth, but from something from space? A light, an explosion, a moment when the sky touched the planet, the fire from the sky hypothesis. And then, as we move away from Earth, from the waters, from the ice layers, another direction opens, not from below, but from the sky. In space, there are objects moving silently in darkness. No light, no sound, only trajectory. And sometimes one of them comes closer, closer to Earth, without warning, impossible to sense until it is very near. A comet, a mass of ice, mixed with rock, from distant regions of the solar system, traveling through space for millions of years, unchanged, until it reaches a point, a trajectory, that brings it close to this planet. This hypothesis suggests that around 12800 years ago, a comet did not need to strike directly. It only needed to break apart in the atmosphere, fragment into many pieces, releasing energy, not in one place, but across a vast area. An explosion without a clear impact crater, but strong enough to alter the surface, burn forests, send dust into the atmosphere, dim the sunlight, not forever, but enough to begin a chain of change. Jung once wrote, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos in all, disorder a secret order, and if you listen deeply, you may notice there are things in life that come from outside, not from you, not under your control, but when they happen, they change everything, not because you chose, but because they arrived. And like a comet, there are moments that appear suddenly, flash brightly, then disappear, but leave behind a deep imprint, the disappearance of the giants. And then, as the cold spreads, as the forests begin to change, as the flow of life is no longer what it once was, something very deep begins to happen. Not loudly, not in a single moment, only absence. Creatures that were once there are no longer. Imagine a world where giants walk the land, slow, heavy, yet full of power. Woolly mammoths with thick fur, crossing icy plains. Saber-toothed cats moving through shadows, silently. Giant sloths, slow, yet impossible to ignore. These creatures did not merely exist. They shaped the world, and then, one by one, they begin to disappear. Not all at once, not in the same place, but within the same span of time, as if an invisible wave moves across the planet, carrying with it an ending. No loud sound, no clear signal. Only, one day, they no longer appear. No new footprints, no movement, only trace, fossils, bones, what remains of a presence. Carl Gustav Jung once wrote, "Every form of addiction is bad. No matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, morphine, or idealism, humans tend to cling to what is familiar, believing it will always be there. But nature does not keep anything, simply because we are used to it. And if you listen deeply, you may notice this loss does not belong only to the earth. It is a deeply human experience. Things once familiar can disappear, not because they were unimportant, but because everything changes. And then, as we look into that disappearance, a quiet question arises, not loud, but persistent. Why? Why did creatures that had lived for millions of years vanish within such a short time? One possibility comes from the environment itself. Climate shifts, temperature drops, vegetation changes, familiar food sources are no longer the same. Land once suitable becomes harsher, not killing instantly, but weakening, reducing the ability to survive. Little by little, large animals need more food, need wide spaces, need stability, and when the environment changes, they are the first to feel the pressure, unable to adapt in time, unable to change fast enough. But that may not be the whole story, because at the same time, another species is emerging. Humans, no longer only small groups, moving, but beginning to expand, hunt, organize, cooperate. Humans are not the strongest, not the fastest, but they have something else, the ability to adapt and to create. They hunt large animals, not because it is easy, but because it is possible. And over time, the pressure from hunting, combined with harsh climate, forms a doubler force, not needing to be overwhelming, only enough to disrupt the balance. Jung once wrote, "Man is not master in his own house." Humans do not fully control everything, yet still they influence the world in ways they do not always realize. And perhaps the answer lies not on one side, not only climate, not only humans, but a combination, two forces, intersecting, amplifying one another, creating a result that cannot be reversed. And if you listen deeply, you may notice there are changes in life that also do not come from a single cause, not just one event, but many things happening together, layered, leading you to a point where everything is no longer the same. And then, when we look deeper, not only at the cause, but at the speed, something makes us pause. The disappearance did not unfold slowly as we imagine, not over millions of years, not a fading stretched endlessly, but very quickly, in the rhythm of nature. Species that had survived through many ice ages, through great changes, still remained, still adapted, still continued, but this time was different. Within a relatively short span, many large species vanished, with no sign of recovery, no return, as if a threshold had been crossed. And this did not happen in just one place, but across many regions, distant lands, not directly connected, yet sharing a pattern, a timing, an outcome. Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Deep transformation often comes with loss, not because it is required, but because it is part of the process." And if you listen deeply, you may notice there are times in life when everything changes quickly, faster than you can understand, faster than you can prepare. Things once stable suddenly are not because you did not try to hold them, but because something has passed a point, a threshold, and beyond that point, change cannot be reversed immediately. It can only be accepted, lived through. The giants did not disappear instantly, but once the process began, it did not stop, it did not slow. It continued until there was nothing left to continue. And then a new world begins to form, without those creatures, without the old rhythm, but a different structure, a new balance. And then, when we look again, not only at the cause, not only at the speed, but at the result, a world without giants. No more heavy footsteps pressed into the earth, no more creatures that once shaped the landscape, only space. And what makes us pause is not only the loss, but its meaning. Those creatures had existed for so long, through many changes, through many trials, as if they would always be there, as a fixed part of the world, and then they were not. Jung once wrote, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. There are things we believe are stable, certain, but in truth, they are only temporary, for a long time, and perhaps this is the deepest lesson of that disappearance. Not fear, but awareness. That everything, no matter how large, no matter how long-lasting, can still change, can still disappear, not because it is weak, but because nothing is permanent. The origin of agriculture, and then, when humans no longer only move, when they begin to stay longer, when they observe, what repeats in nature, something very small, begins to change, not loudly, not clearly, but deeply, the way they look at food. Before that, food was something that had to be found, had to be hunted, had to be pursued, uncertain, unstable, like a game between life and death. But when the climate becomes harsher, when large food sources disappear, when uncertainty increases, a new need appears, not for more, but for stability. Humans begin to notice that there are seeds which, when falling to the ground, will grow, not immediately, but over time, and if they stay long enough, they can return and see food, not something to search for, but to wait for. This is not an invention, not a sudden breakthrough, but a realization, slow, natural, almost accidental. Carl Gustav Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." There are things that do not need to be created from nothing, only to be recognized, to be allowed to grow. And agriculture may have begun like this, not from convenience, not from abundance, but from crisis, when old ways are no longer enough, when life demands a different direction. And if you listen deeply, you may notice there are things in your life that do not begin from ease, but from your most difficult moments, when old options are gone and you are forced to try another way. And then, when that idea appears, not everywhere, not all at once, but in lands with just enough conditions for humans to notice something very subtle, in a region we now call the Middle East, a land not entirely easy to live in, not too harsh, but not abundant either. There grow wild grasses, carrying small seeds, edible, storable, not much, but steady. Humans begin to observe, realizing that when they gather these seeds, some fall to the ground, and after a time, they grow in the same place. A cycle, repeating. No need to travel far, no need to search endlessly, only to stay and wait. And then, a very small action, yet decisive, takes place. Humans no longer only wait, they begin to act, planting seeds, choosing locations, caring, not perfectly, not always successfully, but different, very different. Jung once wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." When humans stop only looking outward and begin to observe more deeply, something awakens. Not knowledge, but understanding. Agriculture was not a sudden leap, but a sequence of small experiments, mistakes, adjustments, observations, repeated across generations. And from this, something unprecedented begins to form. Humans are no longer completely dependent on what they find, but begin to influence what they receive. And if you listen deeply, you may notice there are moments in life when things begin to change, when you no longer only wait, but begin to act. Not something big, just a small action, but enough to change direction. And then, when we look back at the entire journey, from hunting days to moments of staying, to planting the first seeds, to the change in how humans live, something becomes very clear. Agriculture did not arise from abundance, not from an easy world, not when everything was stable, but from crisis, when large prey disappeared, when climate became harsh, when uncertainty grew, when old ways were no longer enough. Humans had no choice. They had to find another way. And within that pressure, something new emerged. Not perfect, not easy, but fitting for a new world. Jung once wrote, "There is no birth of consciousness without pain. There is no awakening without difficulty, no deep transformation without loss." Agriculture was not a great invention at first. It was to response, a way to survive, a way to adapt to a world that was no longer the same. And then, from that, a chain of changes begins. Villages, society, civilization, all of it did not begin from ease, but from a need, a pressure, a limit. And if you listen deeply, you may notice The most important things in life do not come from easy times, but from the moments you are forced to change, when the old path is gone and you must create a new one, not because you are ready, but because you need to. And perhaps this is the deepest meaning of this story, that in the most difficult moments there may be hidden the most important beginnings, the emergence of a new society. And then, when humans begin to stay longer, when they no longer move constantly, when they have a reason to return to the same place, something very important begins to appear, not immediately, not clearly, but deeply: stability. Before that, humans lived in small groups, moving, changing, not attached for long to any one place. Relationships were also fluid, temporary, fitting movement. But when they begin to farm, when they need to return to the same place, when they begin to store food, was tuna, constant movement no longer fits. They stay longer, not just days, but through seasons, through years. And when many people stay in one place, something new appears. Not just a group, but a community. Simple dwellings are built not to move on, but to remain near water, near fields, near each other. People no longer just meet and leave, but live together, share, depend, cooperate. And from this, a new structure gradually forms, not from a plan, not from clear design, but from need, from living together, from needing one another. Jung once wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. When people live together, they do not remain the same. They change, influence one another, create something new. And the first villages are not only places to live, but a transition from individual to collective, from separate survival to a system of shared existence, overlapping causes. And then, when we try to find a clear answer, a single cause, a specific event, a starting point, we begin to realize something. It is not that simple. There is no single cause. There is no complete explanation. There is no answer that can explain everything. Instead, there are many things happening at the same time, layering over one another, interacting with one another, amplifying one another. Fresh water from glacial lakes changes ocean currents. Perhaps an event from space affects the climate. Solar activity may fluctuate. Volcanoes may erupt. Each factor on its own may not be enough, but together they create a profound shift. Carl Gustav Jung once wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Nothing exists in isolation. Things reflect, influence, connect, and the natural world is the same. Not a linear chain, not A causing B, but a network where A affects B, B affects C, and C returns to influence A. A system complex, sensitive, and sometimes impossible to fully predict. And if you listen deeply, you may notice your life also does not have a single cause, not one decision, not one event, but many things, small, accumulating, interacting, leading you to where you are. And then, when we look deeper, not only at individual causes, but at how they interact, something becomes clear. This world does not operate in separate parts, but through chains of reaction. A small change may seem insignificant when alone, but when it touches a system, it does not stop. It spreads, affects other parts, and those parts continue to spread. A freshwater lake bursting is not only water flowing out, it changes ocean salinity. That affects currents. Currents change, temperature changes, temperature changes, ecosystems change, ecosystems change, affect animals, and eventually affect humans. There is no clear stopping point, no clear boundary, only a chain, continuous, connected. Jung once wrote, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." There are connections, not always visible, yet they exist. They influence, and in nature, everything is connected. Nothing is completely separate. Nothing is completely independent. Every change is part of a larger chain, and that means a system may remain stable for a long time, but when enough changes accumulate, it can shift suddenly, not gradually, but quickly. And if you listen deeply, you may notice there are changes in your life that do not begin with one big event, but from small things, repeated, accumulated, until one day everything changes. And then, when we step back, no longer looking at separate parts, but at the whole, something becomes clear. There is no single cause, no single moment, no clear culprit, but a system where everything connects, influences one another, accumulates, amplifies, until a point where change cannot be avoided. Younger Dryas may not be the result of a single event, but a moment when many factors at once to meet, like waves, intersecting and forming a larger wave. Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." There are forces we do not see, do not recognize, yet still shape outcomes. And perhaps the younger Dryas is like that, a result of forces unseen, accumulating, interacting, and then emerging. Not because something was wrong, not because something was right, but because this is how systems move. And if you listen deeply, you may notice there are changes in your life that cannot be explained by a single cause. Not one decision, not one event, but many things, layered, leading you to a point where everything changes. And when that happens, it may feel as if it came suddenly, but in truth, it has been preparing for a very long time. And then, after all of this, another question appears. If this change began so suddenly, could it also end in the same way? And then, after hundreds, thousands of years of cold, after humans have adapted, after the world has changed, something unexpected happens again, not slowly, not gradually, but very quickly. Temperatures to rise, ice melts, the climate stabilizes again, as if the planet has just awakened from a long sleep, the abrupt ending. And then, after centuries, even millennia of cold, of ice, of a world harsh and unpredictable, something happens without warning, not gradual, but sudden. Temperatures begin to rise, not over thousands of years, not slowly as before, but within a period very short, by Earth's standards, just years, decades. Ice begins to melt frozen lands to reveal themselves. Rivers flow again. Ecosystems begin to recover, as if a switch has been turned on. Jung once wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown." There are things that are not solved, but simply outgrown. The younger Dryas did not end because of a clear cause. There was no single ending event, only the system shifting once again as it had begun. And what makes us pause is not only that it ended, but how it ended. Fast, unexpected, not following the slow rhythm we often assign to nature. And if you listen deeply, you may notice there are periods in life that feel long, difficult, unchanging, and then, one day, everything is different. Not gradually, but suddenly. Not because it just began, but because it has been building for a long time. Lessons for the present. And then, as we step away from ancient layers of ice, step away from stories tens of thousands of years old, and return to the present, something not entirely unfamiliar. What has happened is not only history, but a pattern, a way the earth moves, a way systems can change. Today, there is a system still in motion, quiet, not directly visible, yet influencing the entire planet. Ocean currents, a vast flow, moving warm and cold water between oceans, between climate zones, keeping temperature balanced, stable. An important part of this system is called AMOTS, Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. It carries warm water from the tropics northward and returns cold water southward, a circulation continuous, subtle, and this very system was once affected during the Younger Dryas, when fresh water altered salinity, weakened the flow, leading to a major climate shift. And today, a question emerges, not loudly, but deeply. Is this happening again? Studies suggest AMOTS shows signs of slowing, not stopping, not collapsing, but weaker than before. Not a sudden event, but a trend. Slow, quiet, but continuous. Carl Gustav Jung once wrote, "We are living in what the Greeks called the right moment of kairos." There are moments, not because they are large, but because they are thresholds, a crossing point. And if a complex system is pushed toward a threshold, change may occur, not linearly, but suddenly. And if you listen deeply, you may notice there are things in life that do not change immediately. They simply shift slowly until something transforms. And then, when we return to the past, not only to know what happened, but to understand what could happen, the Younger Dryas is not only a cold period, not only an ancient event, but an example, a pattern, a reminder that the earth is not always stable, not always slow, not always predictable. It can change faster than we expect, deeper than we imagine. And what matters is not to repeat exactly what has happened, but to understand that systems can shift. Jung once wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." If we only look outward, we see separate events. But when we look deeper, we begin to see patterns, connections, meaning. And the pattern here is, a complex system can remain stable for a long time, but when enough factors accumulate, it can change very quickly. Not because of one thing, but because many things have reached a threshold. And if you listen deeply, you may notice the past is not far away. It is still here, in the structure of the world, in the way systems move. And perhaps the lesson is not fear, but awareness. To understand that stability is not a default, but a temporary state. And when we understand that, we can see the world differently, not only as it is, but as a system in motion, And then, when all of this settles, when ice, water, and complex systems are no longer just knowledge, but become a feeling, an awareness, the present no longer feels the same, not because it has changed, but because the way we see it has changed. We are living in a stable window, a period, calm enough, balanced enough, to build, to believe that things will continue this way. But perhaps that is not certain, not to create fear, not to create worry, but to understand that this stability may be more fragile than we think. Jung once wrote, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you do not know, the world will tell you." If we do not understand the system we live within, then that system will define us. But when we understand, not to fully control, but to be aware, to see connection, to see interdependence, to see that we are not outside, we are part of that system, influencing and influenced. And if you listen deeply, you may notice there are things in your life you once thought were permanent, stable, unchanging, but in truth, they are simply in a phase, a pause, a breath. And so, perhaps, what matters is not keeping everything unchanged, but understanding that change is part of the system. And when you understand that, you no longer resist it. You learn to move with it, the fragility of the world. And then, after everything we have moved through, from a warming world after the Ice Age, to a sudden freeze, to climate shifts, the disappearance of giant creatures, human adaptation, the birth of agriculture, of society, of civilization, something becomes clear. This world has never stood still. It is not fixed, not permanent, not held in place, simply because we are used to it. It moves, changes, oscillates like a breath, slow, deep, but continuous. There are periods of stability, calm, predictable, and there are periods of disruption, uncertain, beyond control. Jung once wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." There are things outside us that make us pause, not to fear, but to understand. And perhaps this story is not only about Earth, not only about climate, not only about an ancient event, but a mirror, a way to see that change is not the exception, but the nature of things. And if you listen deeply, you may notice your life also does not stand still, not fixed, not completely certain. But that does not mean losing direction. It is an invitation to move with it. And then, when you begin to see the world this way, not as something fixed, but as a flow, something subtle begins to appear. Fragility, not as weakness, but as a quality, a natural part of everything that exists. The oceans, formed over millions of years, could one day change. Forests that once spread across the planet can shift. Ecosystems that seemed eternal can disappear, and humans are no exception. But within that fragility, something else appears. Not insecurity, but value. Because nothing lasts forever. Each moment becomes meaningful. Each stability becomes precious. Each peaceful phase becomes rare. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Perhaps it is this fragility that gives life its depth, not because it is certain, but because it can change. And when you accept that, not just with thought, but with feeling, a different peace appears. Not because everything is stable, but because you no longer need it to be. And if you listen deeply, you may notice some things in life become more beautiful when you know they will not last forever. A quiet evening, a conversation, a moment of peace, not because they last, but because they are here, now. And then, as you continue to look, to listen, something shifts, not in the world, but in how you feel it. You no longer see yourself as outside, observing, analyzing, understanding, but begin to realize you are within it. The water that once flowed through ancient oceans is the same water within your body, not metaphorically, but truly. The atoms within you have once been elsewhere, in soil, in water, in air. You are not separate from Earth. You are a part of it, not as an idea, but as reality. Jung once wrote, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. Even in chaos, there is order, connection, structure we do not always see. And you are part of that structure, not separate, not outside, but participating, connected, influencing. What happens to the planet is not entirely separate from what happens to you. Not directly, but deeply. You change too. You adapt. You move through phases. Stability, then disruption, then stability again, like a living system. Not fixed, not perfect, but always becoming. And if you listen deeply, you may notice you do not need to control everything. You do not need to hold everything still, because you are not outside the flow. You are part of it. And then, after everything, there are no more facts, no more hypotheses, no more questions that must be answered. Only a feeling that this world is always moving, always changing, always passing through cycles we only partly understand. That the stability we are living in is not guaranteed, but a pause, a breath between larger movements. And you are not outside of this. You are not merely observing. You are part of the story, part of the flow, part of the change, part of this planet. Breathing. Jung once wrote, "The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it." Perhaps meaning is not in understanding everything, but in feeling that you are here, in this moment, in a world in motion. And tonight, as you lie down, as you close your eyes, perhaps you do not need to think anymore. No need to search for answers. Just listen to your breath, slowing, softening, deepening, like the breath of this planet itself. And somewhere deep within, you may feel a quietness, not because everything stops, but because you are no longer resisting the flow. You are simply there, present, gentle, at peace. After everything we have journeyed through, from a warming world after the Ice Age, to the sudden freeze of the younger Dryas, to unanswered hypotheses, to traces preserved in Iceland and ocean, from the disappearance of great creatures to human adaptation, to the birth of agriculture, of villages, of society, of the first stories, something deep settles, not an answer, but a feeling that this world never truly stands still. It shifts, it moves, it transforms in ways we cannot fully understand. And yet, we often live as if everything will remain the same, as if stability is the default, as if tomorrow will mirror today, as if the world was made not to change. But this story gently reminds us otherwise, that stability is only a moment, a pause, a breath, between greater movements, and perhaps this is not to create worry, but to awaken. Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." When we look outward, we see events, changes, uncertainty. But when we look inward, we begin to understand that this change exists within us too. You also move through phases, moments of stability, moments of disruption, moments that feel like collapse, and then something new begins. Not immediately, not clearly, but truly. And like the earth, you do not need to understand everything to continue. You do not need to control every change to exist. You only need to be within the flow. Perhaps the most beautiful part of this story is not the science, not the theories, but how it brings us back to our own lives, that everything, big or small, can change, and because of that, each peaceful moment becomes more precious, each slow breath deeper, each night softer. And tonight, as you listen, you do not need to think anymore. No need to explain, no need to solve. Just let go. Feel your body becoming lighter, your breath slowing, your mind softening, like the earth after its turbulence, finding balance again. You too can, to rest, not because everything is perfect, but because you do not need to keep trying. In this moment, let this story fade into silence, like melting ice, like flowing water, like the memories of a planet settling. And as you close your eyes, remember one simple thing. You are not outside this world. You are part of it, part of the flow, part of the change, part of the story, still unfolding. Wishing you a deep, peaceful, and gentle sleep. If you feel even a little more relaxed after this journey, take a quiet moment to subscribe to Stories for Sleep so that each night you always have a new story to accompany you gently and deeply into sleep.